The city park was drowning in the evening shadows, the air warm and rich with the smell of roasting meat. The sun slipped slowly toward the horizon, leaving behind a soft pinkish light that seemed to freeze in the air. There were picnics everywhere, voices could be heard, laughter, and the playful shouts of children racing a ball across the grass. At that moment it seemed that everything around was absorbed by carefreeness, and the summer promised to be long and peaceful. Amidst all these familiar scenes, amidst the chirping of birds and cheerful conversations, a small group of people gathered for a barbecue stood out. They were standing around the barbecue, talking and laughing, the smell of fried chicken wings and kebabs wafting through the air. It was a family. Mother, father, uncle, and a teenager sitting a little apart, but with eyes wide open, watching every movement carefully. A young boy named Jason was like a part of this quiet moment. He was smiling, joking with his brother, enjoying the warmth of the evening and the company of his family. It seemed as if nothing could disrupt this perfect evening. But there was tension in his eyes, a barely perceptible but palpable sense of wariness that was overwhelmed by the atmosphere of fun. It was at that moment, as another portion of meat was taken off the grill and passed to the table, that everything changed. The patrol car driving down the lane was the first signal. Jason looked up, and his gaze locked on the white silhouette of a police car moving slowly toward them. It was something trivial, like a routine check, but at that moment, something in the air changed. He felt a cold shiver go down his spine. Somehow, the gaze of the policeman who was scrutinizing every movement on the set wasn't just professional. It was something else. A tense malice slid in it, as if something inside this man was touched by his presence among the people, as if something didn't add up to what he was seeing. Jason looked away quickly and tried to focus on his brother again, but a strange sense of unease lingered in his gaze. He felt his chest tighten and his breathing become heavy. He knew something was going wrong, that this wasn't just an ordinary passing car. Sometimes an intuition, especially one like his, a teenager surviving in this world, isn't wrong. The car stopped for a moment. Then the policeman got out. It was as if everything around him instantly went quiet, though no one wanted to realize that silence was the harbinger of storms. Jason stared at his figure, which was slowly becoming a threat. His gaze was cold and his movements mechanical. He hadn't seen it before, but now it was obvious. There was no room for a mere man here. This wasn't just a cop. This was a man who saw him not just as a teenager, but as a threat, a problem. Jason felt his heart pounding faster than usual. He looked around. His parents, his uncle, everyone was absorbed in their own business, laughing, chatting casually. They didn't notice what was happening. But he knew everything was about to change. This evening, full of carefree fun, would soon turn into something obscurantist. A premonition of trouble flashed in his eyes, but he could not stop what was already beginning. With the light hum of the evening wind, which barely moved the leaves on the trees, Jason and his family's attention was drawn to something alien to their usual calm. In the distance, down the narrow lane, a patrol car was slowly approaching. Its headlights, like two cold eyes, pierced the twilight, sending shivers down their spines. The sound of the engine and the steady rhythm of the policeman's footsteps as he stepped out of the car blended into the silence of the park, like the harbingers of an approaching storm. The policeman walked steadily, almost mechanically, his steps inevitable and ruthless. His gaze slid down the rows of picnickers, fixing on the group where Jason stood out among the happy faces. There was more to his gaze than mere duty. It was something sinister, a secret contempt hidden behind a mask of official coldness. His every move reflected intent, as if he had come not to check order but to assert his authority over this place. The family, previously immersed in carefree laughter and conversation, suddenly felt time slow down. The eyes of those present turned involuntarily to the figure of the policeman. His face, devoid of emotion, seemed to radiate an icy indifference, but in the depths of his eyes lurked something threatening, something that spoke of long-buried anger. At that moment, the park became an arena where every movement, every sound took on a new, sinister meaning. Jason felt a mixture of fear and anxiety boiling up inside him. His heart raced, and he tried to figure out what it was that was causing such hostility in the strange man. He saw the policeman's gaze linger on him, as if he saw something in the teenager that needed to be addressed. Every minute seemed like an eternity, and every second a step toward the inevitable confrontation. Jason's parents exchanged wary glances as they watched, realizing that their peaceful party was no longer theirs alone. Even the laughter that had recently filled the air now seemed like an echo of the distant past, drowned out in the tense silence. It was as if an invisible shadow had fallen over this corner of the park, making everyone feel the inevitability of the changes that were about to break into their lives. The policeman, as if he were the master of an unseen territory, moved forward slowly, his gait confident and his face impassive. He clearly wasn't just passing through, he was looking for someone, and his attention was directed precisely at the group where Jason was. In that instant, the shadows on the horizon became an ominous metaphor for what was coming, an unknown force ready to shatter the illusion of safety and tranquility. Every minute of waiting turned into an agonizing longing, and every movement of the policeman into a portent of an impending storm. The gazes of friends and relatives crossed, full of anxiety and distrust, for no one could explain this silent but insistent onslaught of a force that seemed to have come to rob them of their peace. Meanwhile, against the flickering lights of the park, the shadows grew denser and denser, and night was approaching with inevitable force. The whole world seemed to stand still, waiting for the moment when calm would finally give way to cruel reality. And in this growing tension was a sign that the evening would turn out to be something far more serious than the moment it had begun. Before we continue, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, and whether you have had a similar experience in your life. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss further events. We continue. The moment the patrol car was about to stop, Jason felt the cop's gaze on him like an icy stab to his skin. It was a look of unrelenting contempt that penetrated his very soul, making his heart beat faster. He clenched his fists involuntarily, feeling his every movement, every blink become the subject of heartless evaluation. The policeman approached the group with a stride in which there was not the slightest hesitation, as if his every minute had been counted out in advance. As if this man was the embodiment of inexorable strength, he moved without noticing the smiles, conversations, and carefree laughter that had filled the air just a few moments ago. His face remained cold and impenetrable, but his eyes, the ones that looked at Jason, were full of aggression. It wasn't just a look of duty. It was an order, a demand for obedience that allowed no objection. Jason's heart fluttered with fear and anger at the same time. He tried to comprehend why he was the object of such hostility, why that gaze was arousing in him a fear comparable to a sudden glimpse of danger. He felt the tension in the air thicken, as if the atmosphere itself were preparing for an invisible battle. The moment seemed an eternity, and every sound, even the quiet rustle of the wind, sounded like thunder. The policeman came closer without saying a word, and his face, illuminated by the cold light of the street lamps, seemed disfigured by determination and hidden contempt. His demeanor, even in such a peaceful setting, suggested that he considered his presence an absolute right. It was as if his whole life had been about suppressing any form of dissent, and every look, every movement of those who did not conform to his notions of order was an occasion for cruel punishment. Jason felt his inner struggle tearing himself apart. On the one hand, he wanted to run away, to hide, to forget himself in the crowd, and, on the other hand, there was an urge inside him to resist, a screaming demand to prove his worth, his humanity. His soul was screaming, but the voice of his mouth was traitorously silenced. That moment, when the policeman had come so close that Jason could almost feel the coldness of his breath, was a painful, indelible scar. The scene froze in slow motion. The policeman's gaze meeting the teenager's eyes was filled with the promise of violence. The world around them seemed to cease to exist, giving way only to two souls on the verge of collision. The tension was reaching its limit, and at that moment, everyone present involuntarily felt that something was about to happen that would change their lives forever. Suddenly, what had seemed to be only a portent of impending trouble turned into a storm of violence. Suddenly, the policeman lunged forward and grabbed Jason's arm without wasting a second. The moment their bodies made contact, it was as if the whole world shook with a shock wave of violence. From the first sound that came out of the policeman's mouth, the space was filled with venomous words full of racism and humiliation. The voice, shrill and determined, came at Jason, who, stunned and confused, could not comprehend what was happening. The words were like icy daggers piercing his inner self, leaving behind scars that would be hard to forget. Instantly, those around him stood up to defend the teenager. Parents and other relatives, stunned by the unexpected attack, rushed forward to stop what was happening. But every time someone tried to approach, the policeman brutally pushed back the interveners with his hands, as if he felt threatened by even the slightest touch. His movements were honed and ruthless, and his face, distorted with anger, seemed to ignore neither pleas nor entreaties for mercy. With each stroke of words and each sharp movement, the violence took on the form of not only physical, but also mental abuse. The odor of tension and fear lingered in the air, mixing with the smoke from the brazier to create an atmosphere of unbearable cruelty. Jason, caught in a vortex of alien rage, felt his world crumble in an instant. His eyes widened with fear, and his body trembled as if unable to defend itself. The faces of those present showed a mixture of horror and rage. Every blow, every dismissive word seemed to confirm that the system, embodied in the policeman, was determined to break any attempt at resistance. In that moment, the park, previously filled with laughter and joy, became an arena of ruthless violence, where human dignity was brutally violated. Despite all the attempts of those around him to protect Jason, the policeman, like a beast defending its territory, rejected any help. His aggression knew no bounds. Even the sounds of protest and indignation echoed in the silence, adding fuel to the fire. The looks of the passers-by, in which fear and indignation mingled, reflected the tragic truth that cruelty can penetrate the most ordinary evening and destroy everything around. At that moment, as the violence reached its climax, the world around us froze in anxious anticipation of what was to come. Everyone present felt that this brutal act was not a one-time outbreak, but the beginning of a long and painful ordeal, one that would make us think about the price of power, about what justice is, and about how vulnerable human life is in the face of arbitrary violence. The outbreak of violence had turned into an agonizing struggle for human dignity, and now the entire family, gripped by anxiety, tried to speak in Jason's defense. But their voices, filled with despair and fear, were drowned out by the roar of commanding commands and the threatening glances of the policemen. Every inquisitive glance, every uncertain movement seemed dangerous, as if in this city any wrong move could be the last. The mother, clutching a towel covered in sweat and fear, tried to step forward, but her hands shook so that she could barely utter a word of protest. Her father, always confident and strong, now clenched his teeth, his gaze wandering between fear for his son and rage against injustice, but the words stuck in his throat. The uncle, a veteran with combat experience, tried to contain his fervor, realizing that open confrontation could only make matters worse. All of them, united by their common pain, were silent in Jason's defense, even if their protest was expressed only in stares, tension, and impotent gestures. Jason himself, cut off from the support of his loved ones, felt the fire of humiliation and despair burning inside him. He tried to resist, to fight off the inexorable force of the policemen, but every effort he made was met with an insurmountable wall of fear and cruelty imposed by the laws of this world. His soul cried out for freedom and justice, but his voice was silenced under the weight of hopelessness. He felt invisible chains binding him, depriving him of the ability to move and scream, depriving him of any chance of resistance. There was a tense silence in which everyone present realized that the struggle for life had become a wordless protest, a protest that did not need loud shouts or cries of despair. Every glance, every uncertain attempt to make any movement became a symbol of resistance, even if they seemed insignificant and powerless in the face of brutal power. This silent protest, filled with pain and fear, was a clear indication that in the heart of every human being lives the desire to defend their freedom, even if words do not find their way into a world ruled by fear and violence. As the tension reached its peak, the atmosphere around him seemed almost palpable, as if the air itself had gathered into a single wall, reflecting the protest of everyone who tried to protect Jason. And, despite the brutality and oppression, this silent, almost mute battle for human dignity spoke to the fact that even in our darkest moments, there is a spark of resistance within us that can be the beginning of change. Jason's uncle stood back in the shadows, watching, as if a battle were playing out in his soul, a battle between his military discipline and his deep sense of family responsibility. Every gesture of the policeman, every dismissive word that came out of his mouth, gripped the veteran's heart, stirring memories of past battles and lost comrades. He knew that if he did not intervene now, the guilt would haunt him for the rest of his life. But to intervene now also meant an indescribable danger, unpredictable and ruthless, capable of unleashing a new wave of tragedy on everyone. His uncle remembered the years spent on the battlefield when decisions had to be made instantly, despite fear and doubt. Now he faced a different battle, a battle for truth, for honor, for the life of young Jason, who might become the next victim of a system that turned the law into an instrument of repression. His soul raged with conflicting feelings. Long experience demanded prudence and caution, while his heart, soaked with love and pain, cried out for the immediate protection of his nephew. The veteran's gaze slid over the faces of those around him, faces filled with fear and helplessness, faces that reflected the gravity of the moment. He saw his parents' hands trembling, the flicker of despair in his mother's eyes, and all this intensified his inner struggle. Flashes of memories of the past, of losses and unfulfilled promises, crept into his thoughts, making him doubt. Could he ever again be the one to dare to stand up to a cruel injustice, even if the consequences were unpredictable? Every second seemed like an eternity as he stood on the line between silent observation and a decisive step. Uncle knew that if he let fear take over, he would lose not only his honor, but his soul as well. His inner voice, honed by years of service and trial, loudly demanded intervention. He felt every cell in his body ready to rush forward, awakening in him the courage that would not fail at the critical moment. But his mind told him that one wrong move could turn into a new tragedy, a new round of violence in which innocence would suffer. These thoughts shackled him like invisible chains, but at the same time they spurred his resolve. A realization was maturing inside him. Human dignity could not be preserved at the cost of silence. If he did not intervene now, his duty, his honor, and the memory of those who had fallen in the fight for freedom would forever be tarnished by inaction. Finally, straddling the line between doubt and determination, Jason's uncle took a deep breath, and his gaze, full of determination and pain, swept toward his sister's son. In that moment, everything seemed frozen. Every breath, every sound around him intensified to the extreme. He knew that now, despite fear and all the warnings of reason, it was his duty to protect his kinsman, even if the price for doing so was too high. The human dignity for which he had fought so hard all his life demanded a decisive step, and he could not retreat. Before we continue, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from, and if you've ever had a similar experience. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new events. We continue. Time stood still. It seemed that even the air around them, soaked with the smell of burning coal and stress, was silent, as if gathering for the last decisive moment. Jason's uncle, standing in the shadows, fists clenched, felt his heart pounding in his chest as every cell in his body screamed for one thing: we have to act. But there were so many obstacles standing in the way of that decision that his steps became slow, almost pulling him backward. Thoughts swirled in his head like a propeller kicking up dust, and in this storm there was only one answer: he must act. But what kind of action was that? What to do when one mistake could be fatal? He knew that his intervention could be perceived as aggression, as a threat to the policeman, as an act of violence that had no justification. The words that tormented his mind relentlessly were like stones that could not just disappear. He knew that his actions would be judged not in terms of justice, but in terms of force. His experience, his service in the military, in which every move was important, every choice painfully significant, could not help in these moments. He realized that any step he took in this direction would change the whole picture of what was happening, that the consequences would unfold quickly and unpredictably. The man closed his eyes, feeling the impenetrable spiral of doubt twisting again and again in his chest. But with each new look, with each threatening word from the policeman, his resolve began to eclipse his fear. Jason, his nephew, his bloodline was at risk, and if he didn't intervene now, his whole life, all the years he'd spent teaching himself restraint, honor, and fortitude, would be in vain. He could not afford to stand by. But the fear of the possible consequences. What if the cop got out of the situation unscathed? What if he turned his uncle into the aggressor and Jason himself into an even more violent target? It all hung in the air like an unknowable threat that was impossible to ignore. He realized that his actions could cause a tragedy, change the lives of not only him and his family, but everyone around him. What would happen if it caused even Jason himself to find himself in a worse situation than before? And he knew that intervening could be the point at which there was no going back. The man looked at his nephew, the one he had raised, the one he had once told about honor, about fighting for the truth. His gaze was full of despair and determination at the same time. In that moment, his uncle felt his own life losing significance, as all his experience, all the lessons he had learned, pushed him toward a choice that required no words, only action. He remembered how, in the most difficult situations on the battlefield, every moment required him to take decisive steps, not deliberation. Now, in this park, the same choice was before his eyes, and it was more than just a confrontation with a cop. It was a clash with the system, with what was wrong and unfair, with what had to be stopped. The internal conflict that had been raging in the veteran's soul had reached a climax. He stepped forward. He could no longer stand idly by. Every move he made was like a pattern breaking. He felt all his experience, all those years upon which his inner fortitude had held, disintegrating. This was no longer a reflection. It was a moment when all decisions were merging into one. Fear was disappearing, giving way to determination. As his foot took the first step toward the conflict, the world around him seemed to slow down. The policeman, who had seemed strong and uncontrollable before, suddenly didn't seem so sure. All attention was focused on him. Jason's uncle raised his head, his gaze straight and determined. He looked at the policeman like a man who, despite his doubts, realized that he had no other choice. He told himself that his action would be the right thing to do. It was not a show of violence, not an act of aggression, but an act of defense, an act to which he was obliged. But what would happen next? At that moment, when things were already going the other way, when his actions became a reality, he didn't yet know where it would lead. That determination. It was both a release, a safety net, and a question. But he was ready for the consequences. He was ready to confront everything that would follow, because he realized that now, in this moment, he was deciding the fate not only of his own, but of his nephew, of his family, of this entire system that tolerated such injustice. Each step forward was like an explosion, tearing apart the previous order, and a spark ignited in his soul, pushing him to action, to fight. Jason's uncle made his move and everything around him seemed to freeze. His chest filled with fervent determination, but as he approached the policeman, the look he gave him in return was no longer just a policeman's look. It was full of something dark, something familiar, something that old wounds could not hide. There was more than contempt in the policeman's eyes. It was something more personal. Jason's uncle froze. That look, he knew it. He'd felt it. This wasn't just a casual encounter. It was much deeper than that. The veteran's heart shook, as if he was back on a battlefield where losing was not an option. The policeman, frozen, waiting for a reaction, suddenly wrinkled his nose, as if all his cruel smugness had suddenly disappeared. And at that moment, when the lingering silence was interrupted by heavy breathing, the uncle felt his past come to the surface like a dirty stain that he had long tried to hide, but could not forget. He remembered that terrible day when he, still young and inexperienced, had met those who wore the uniform, but underneath it lurked not the ideals of justice, but the shadows of violence. He recognized this man, recognized his face, his demeanor, his violent mannerisms. This was the same policeman who had once been part of the dark deeds hidden under the mask of the law, part of the covert operations in which he himself, as a naive novice, had become an accidental witness. This policeman was not just an officer of the law. He was a man whose hands were covered with the blood of those who had fallen victim to his invisible but cruel game. The veteran, realizing this, felt the weight of old, unhealed wounds tearing at his chest. He knew that this policeman was one of the reasons why the world was so unfair. This moment, his life, his duty, his service was not random. Everything was connected. He found himself here, in front of this man who seemed to know too much. His return to this story could not have been accidental. It was meant to be. The moment when all this horror was going to come out, when the family was going to face what haunted it, when all this violence, hidden under the cover of the law, was going to be exposed. Silently, the policeman finally spoke a few words. His voice was cold and indifferent, but there was a menace in it, barely concealed behind the outward calm. "You don't realize where you've stepped," he said, and in his voice, in his tone, there was that unbearable, murderous tinge that could not be mistaken. Those words, those phrases, were like a brand piercing the soul. He realized that if he didn't stop this policeman, if he didn't protect his nephew, their lives would become part of his personal revenge, part of his evil world. This wasn't just a clash of random people. This was a meeting of those whose lives were already intertwined by fate, whose actions had become part of a larger, tangled maze of cruelty and betrayal. Everything he had done, all his service in the army, all those years of fighting his inner demons, all those efforts, all those moments had become part of one big story about how a system hiding behind the mask of justice could kill, destroy, break. And now, in the face of this policeman, he saw all the evil that lurked beneath that mask. He realized that every step, every decision had brought him to this point, and now he was ready to do what he should have done long ago: stop it. But even at this moment, when everything became clear, a heaviness did not leave his soul. This was not just a moment of triumph. It was an inevitability, cruel and uncontrollable. All he had to do was realize that fighting this man was not just personal, but part of the fight for justice, for life, and each of them, including his nephew, were bound by this moment, this choice. But the veteran knew one thing: if he didn't stop him now, things would get worse. The moment Jason's uncle had stepped toward the policeman without hesitation had been a turning point. The outbreak of violence, the sudden intervention he had been prepared to make, had had consequences no one could have predicted. Instantly, the whole atmosphere, which had seemed tense but still tolerable, turned upside down. It was as if someone had pulled an invisible string, and the world around them began to crumble, collapsing into a pile of rubble. The policeman, who had been holding back his tension until his boundaries had been violated, suddenly collapsed into a rage. He had not expected anyone to act, that anyone would dare to break his monopoly of force. With every word, with every gesture that now came out of his mouth, it was clear. He was not just a guardian of the law, he was an aggressor who considered himself untouchable. He pushed Uncle Jason away so hard that he nearly lost his balance. The veteran, however, despite his age and past wounds, did not back down. His gaze was hard, his body ready to fight, and despite the fear that gripped him, he realized this was not just a skirmish. This was his nephew's life, their future, his duty not to give up, not to retreat. The moment he spoke up in Jason's defense, he knew their lives would change. This was no longer just a personal battle for justice. It was a fight for their right to exist in a world where the law had become a tool of oppression. He could feel it in his body, in his breathing, in the way the air around them became more and more oppressive. He knew the consequences would be devastating. In a world where law enforcement wore uniforms that concealed brutality and racism, interference could turn tragic. When the policeman, completely out of control, yelled loudly, his words full of hate and threats echoing in the air. "You don't realize who you're messing with." His voice was like a whip whipping the space around him. The family stood in a daze, unable to believe their eyes. Those words, spoken with such indifference, with such assertiveness, seemed more than just a threat. It was a symbol of how far those who wear a uniform and think the law is their own personal game can go. Jason felt something inside him snap. His heart was beating so hard in his chest that he could barely breathe. He realized that if it hadn't been for his uncle's decisive move, if he hadn't intervened, his life might have been cut short on the spot. He would have become just another face in the statistics, another victim of a system that never saw him as a person, only a threat. But now, thanks to his uncle, thanks to his willingness to take risks, their lives had taken on new meaning. But the moment his uncle made the move, he knew it wasn't just his decision. His intervention jeopardized not only his life, but the lives of everyone around him. Tensions were running high. The family was in the midst of devastating events. A confused police officer drew his weapon, and in that moment the air around him was filled with a threat that hadn't been there before. The veteran, feeling his own life hanging in the balance, realized he had become part of a game in which no one wins, in which there are no winners, only survivors. Every moment seemed to be the last. Everyone around them, even the passers-by, seemed to feel the tension and at the same time were afraid to interfere, not realizing what might happen if one of them stepped aside. The veteran felt his courage begin to melt as the policeman shot up, signaling his willingness to go all the way. At that moment, time seemed to stand still. He looked into Jason's eyes, and in that look he saw something more. The realization that everything they were experiencing might have been the first step to something bigger that couldn't be stopped. The seconds dragged on like hours. Jason didn't know what to do. He was filled with fear and adrenaline. He saw his uncle in mortal danger, trying to protect him. He saw the policeman slowly, step by step, advancing toward him, willing to do anything to punish the violators of order. This was not just a clash between two people. It was a clash of two worlds. The world they lived in and the world that was trying to destroy them. The family stood in a daze. Each of them felt that if the situation did not change, if the intervention did not bring results, the consequences could be the worst. But the uncle, despite all this horror, was not going to back down. He knew, if he stopped, if he doubted his actions, they would be doomed. And this understanding, this realization that their entire lives now hung in the balance, gave him strength, even as everything else sought to consume him. He took another step, and a fire lit up in his eyes that could not be extinguished. And then, in that moment, everything hung in the air, and Jason realized his life, his future, their future steps, depended on what was happening right now. When everything collapsed, when the air filled with fear and threat suddenly became weightless, everything seemed impossible. The veteran stood there, unable to move, his gaze, full of pain, fatigue, and determination, was directed straight into the policeman's face. A moment that seemed like an eternity froze in midair, like a frozen frame in which everything that had ever happened collided in a single moment to reveal itself. Jason stood beside him, feeling his heart beating loudly, his life hanging in the balance, and every breath in that space becoming heavy and important. The policeman, weapon in hand, was ready for action. His eyes, already filled with anger and malice, now reflected the very threat he was ready to use. He clenched his fists, and there was something so sure and violent in his movements that there seemed to be no room for doubt on his face. He was sure of his rightness, of his power. But Jason's uncle did not back down. He continued to stand, not giving the policeman a chance to go any further. A moment filled with anxiety and unbearable tension was quickly turning into tragedy. The veteran could have stepped back. He could have let the policeman pass to avoid violence, but he knew that would have been a betrayal. His life, his duty, everything he had learned in his years of service screamed that they could not yield in the face of this injustice. But it all happened so fast. An explosion, the gunfire, a rumble that traveled through the park, leaving no corner unscathed. It wasn't part of their plan, but it became part of their story. The screams, sounds they couldn't ignore because it was part of their fear, their pain. The veteran felt something inside him tear, as if his entire life, this entire struggle, his duty to his nephew and his family had collapsed in an instant. He saw how his own actions had become part of this tragedy. He knew the consequences, the repercussions of his intervention would be devastating. But what else could he do? Jason, standing beside him, felt his world crumble. He knew that nothing would ever be the same and that no action, no word could bring them back to a world where there was even a small hope of justice. He felt his life hanging on the edge as the inexorable passage of time and the choices made for them ripped away everything they had ever known. He saw his uncle, a man who was willing to give his life for his family, trapped in the worst possible way. Everything they had dreamed of seemed gone. The sound that followed the gunshot was almost like destruction. It passed through him like an invisibly penetrating weapon that left behind scars and destruction. But what had happened? Who was to blame for this tragedy? How was it possible that the fight for justice they had waged and the fight for defense could not win? The thin line between salvation and loss had been breached. In this world, full of cruelty and injustice, there was not and could not be a simple answer. The veteran stood alone amidst the destruction, his gaze frozen and his body tired. He could feel his strength drying up, his convictions losing meaning. He had fought for the truth, for his nephew's life. But now that all these events had reached their climax, he realized that the law itself, the order itself, did not always have redemption. He knew that this struggle would never end. He knew that at least one life had been saved, at least one step had been taken, but one life was still lost. Jason turned to look for comfort in his uncle's eyes, but saw only a reflection of the same horror and unspeakable despair that filled them. Justice is not something that comes at once. Justice is not something that can be achieved quickly. It eludes them, leaving behind only vague questions and a sense of pain. Why? Why did they find themselves in this world where every choice is a step towards the unknown? Why has the law, which should protect, become an instrument of fear? The veteran knew that now that the whole truth had been revealed, now that everything they had experienced had become an inescapable part of their reality, they could not go back. The story of their struggle, of their steps toward justice, was far more complicated than they could ever have imagined. This moment, the moment when everything changed, was not just a tragedy but a revelation. Every step in this story was connected to another. Every action became part of this network that they could not break. And now, after everything, after what had happened, they found themselves at a crossroads, in a world where nothing would ever be the same again. Their destinies intertwined, and this story, full of tragedy and revelation, will stay with them forever. What do you think about this story? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Have you experienced racism in your life? Your opinions are very important to us, and we value each and every one of you. Subscribe to the channel, give us a like if you liked it, and don't forget how important it is to support each other. We wish you a good day.